10 a.m. It's time to have a celebratory drink to talk about the life of Jesus, according to Geoff Ryman. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and not just any books, but today we'll be talking about Him by Geoff Ryman. It came out in December, and I think you should go and read it because it's a brilliant book in every possible way or form. I will assume that you have not read the back cover text because there's a big spoiler in there, and I am much nicer than I pretend to be and won't talk about that until we reach the sort of spoiler part of this. Anyway, go and fucking read it. It also seems to be free on Audible right now, so listen to Geoff Ryman read it to you. Why not? Anyway, we'll do the usual thing. I'll give you a quick synopsis, tell you why you have to read the book, then I'll have another sip of this celebratory beer, and then we'll talk about why I think it's such a brilliant book, and from then on, there will be spoilers, even about how the story of Jesus ends. Anyway, let's get started, shall we? Well, as I said, Him by Geoff Ryman is the story of Jesus, whom some call the Christ, but only some. Anyway, it's a historical novel with some maybe science fictional, fantastical, supernatural, whatever elements, because, you know, it's Jesus. There's miracles and stuff. Anyway, it does read more like a historical novel, and it focuses on the historical context of a thoroughly Hellenized or mostly Hellenized Palestine under, Roman occupation, all of that stuff, the different social implications of that, and the story is told through the eyes of Mariam, who is, of course, some call her Mary or Maria, depending on your country. Names are more traditionally Hebrew in this one, so her name is Mariam, and she is the main point of view character. So the focus is on youth, upbringing, and of course the family and the cost to the family for, having a very, very special child in their midst. It does focus on all of these things, and it gives a wonderful sort of panoramic view at the kind of society that breeds messiahs, what that may be, and how that society treats the people associated with messiahs, and so forth. It's a marvelous book. I can't recommend it enough. If you're interested in historical novels, go read the book. If you're interested in, Jesus Christ, for historical or even religious reasons, go read the book. It does treat the whole subject with a lot of, sincerity, I would say, and still manages to say some really interesting things about where religion comes from, what religion and faith can do, how we engage with the universe, and how the universe may engage with us. So go read the goddamn book. Cheers. All right, now that you have read the book, let's talk a bit about it. Let's talk about spoilers and talk about why this is such a brilliant book and what I think is, or what I took away from reading this book, because, your mileage may vary, or so I've heard. It may even be kilometers. Who knows? Anyway, let's start. So the first part is, of course, the difficulty of writing about a figure like Jesus Christ. Now, we in the West have been influenced by Christianity for the last 2,000 years. Whether we want to or not, whether we believe or not, our culture has been heavily formed and molded by that stuff and by what happened back in the day in Palestine. So it's interesting to see people engaging with that and trying to write about it, especially if you come from a more, science fictional background. It's like, how do you treat with that? If you are a believer, do you just tell the story just like another, gospel, so to speak, and retell it as it is basically written in those four that we have and all the others that we kind of also have? You add in some Flavius Josephus and you're done. Do you take the miracles seriously? Do you assume Jesus is in some form part of the Trinity, Son of God, whatever you want to call him? Do you do that? Or do you completely deconstruct it and turn it into a very angry story about a, madman in all kinds of ways? There have been attempts to do all of this, but it's one of the major questions that you need to ask yourself before writing, and that is also something that will, whether we want it or not, color or frame our expectations when reading the book. And I think there's no way to go about it. I think Geoff Ryman's approach is probably one of the, well, most open or most honest approaches, because while it does, of course, have the major twist that is revealed on the back cover that Jesus is, in fact, a trans man in this version of the story, it does still sort of leave things in the background and focuses mostly on the historical aspects, focuses mostly on the society around it, why it is maybe in need for, or at least able to produce someone that can fill that specific role. So I think that is one very important aspect, and I think the other important aspect is the thing that I already mentioned in the quick synopsis: the focus on the childhood, on the upbringing, and on the cost of the family. I think that is a very good approach to doing that. So let's move on and talk a bit about the historical aspects and why I think these are really, really important for what I think makes the whole thing come together so well at the end. As, you know, a quick side note, when it comes to the miracles, yes, they happen. They're not fully explained. There's obviously, when you look at genre fiction websites, everyone's talking about their parallel universes and stuff like that. And yeah, okay, but it's just one way to keep the miracles in there, because they are important for the story, without, focusing too much on it. I think that's why, partly why Ryman took the way he took, because it allows to put all of that together, and it leads us to that final end of the story, which is heartbreaking in a lot of ways, but it's also, not unexpected. I mean, that's the other part, right? If you tell the story of Jesus Christ, everyone knows how that story ends. The fact that we don't get the crucifixion, that we don't get the resurrection, that we don't get any of that, I think, is a very powerful and deliberate choice, and we'll come back to that near the end of this conversation. So, the historical context. Now, here's something that I think helps to understand, or makes the whole story so interesting, because late Second Temple Judaism and thoroughly or mostly Hellenized Palestine under the beginning of the Roman occupation is a fascinating place in a lot of ways. It's a fascinating place and a fascinating time. And if you've read, say, Flavius Josephus, you get a bit of a picture of what's going on there. There's other sources, historical sources that you can read. I absolutely recommend you do that at some point in your life, just because it's such an interesting place and time. You have a very specific culture, that being being Judaism, with all its different sects, all focused on that one place, the temple in Jerusalem. That's sort of like the one place and the one thing that everyone can sort of agree on, that, yeah, we got to be there for Passover. Everything else we can sort of work out, but whoever has charge of the temple has a way to form and, influence the whole of Judaism at the time. You have the overlap between people that, between ethnicity and faith, or different splinter groups of the faith in there. You have people that have been thoroughly Hellenized over the last centuries, and have taken on a lot of Greek, or Hellenic, or Hellenistic in this case, of course, behavior, cultural practices and so forth, people that go to the gymnasium, people that do all those things that are seen as a sign of the upper class, so to speak, because under Hellenism and then later, of course, under Roman occupation, being part of that upper class society brings with it economic and societal capital in a lot of ways. Whereas being a hardcore religious Jew at the time, or believer in Judaism, will, with all the cultural practices that are, of course, sometimes opposed to parts of Hellenism, does, give you maybe cultural credit in a lot of ways with your fellow religionists, but does possibly prevent you from all the material benefits of being less religious. It's the background for the Maccabee revolutions or rebellions that you may or may not have heard about. It's a fascinating time with a lot of tensions, a lot of rivalries, religious, cultural, societal, economic rivalries, tensions and so forth. And it's rife with the expectation that something has to give somewhere, in some form or other, which is, of course, the perfect time to have an individual become the Messiah in a way, have that cultural impact that the life of Jesus does have in a lot of ways, whether believe or not. And I think Geoff Ryman does a great job of portraying that in all the ways that he does, with Mariam being married off to Joseph, who in this version is a bit of a religious rebel. I don't want to use the word nut job, but he's certainly a bit of a radical that is being banished from the center of Orthodox Judaism, from Jerusalem, from the temple, because he's thought his religious ideas are too far out. And so they're banished to the arse end of the country, which is Nazareth, and the family living in poverty, trying to connect with the rest of this village, town, where economic pressure is far more of a thing than religious pressure, which is why they get banished there, where you have people where religious capital, where cultural capital is what you deal with. You get banished to a place where the daily need of economic issues puts those religious controversies into the background. And then we see over time how the family is trying to do those things. It's why Yeshu and Jacob start working for the architect, who is thoroughly Hellenized in a lot of ways, which is why he's called the way he's called, and his job is called the way his job is. All of this is deliberate, and it's fairly nuanced, and I think it's really, really well done in that regard. And you have later on Babatha, the sister, marrying into an economic rich group that has newly adopted or reinvigorated their faith, or lack of faith, their display of religiosity, to be part of the Jewish community, even though they're ethnically not part of that. So you have that overlap of new converts, new adopters that bring economic affluence into the place, but require certain other ways of measuring your status. And that whole sort of hornet's nest of different expectations and different parts of society, these fault lines, I think, are really well shown in this in this story, and the way it centers the family on mostly the life of Mariam, who is a bit of a religious rebel of herself, and really wants to have opportunities that women don't necessarily have in that time. Which brings us, of course, to the next part here, and that is, of course, Abigail turning into Yeshu. Now, I'll just say this: I'm not a trans person. I'm not the best versed in trans discourse either. I'll try to not offend anyone and use the proper language. If I fail, I'm really, really sorry. Please let me know what I did wrong, and I'll try to do better next time. But I think it is important here, because it does touch on something. See, Yeshu is born as Abigail, and later on decides to, or proclaims, whatever we want to call that, that they want to be a boy and want to be called Yeshu, in remembrance of a childhood friend who died. And all of that is well done. What is interesting here is, I think, because it's told from Mariam's perspective, and well, with Ryman being a person from Turf Island, I think there's an interesting aspect here, because the way Mariam treats Abigail, and later on Yeshu, when Yeshu is Yeshu, basically, or wants to be Yeshu, the rejection there is something that we've seen with a lot of the more radical Turf group, people that feel like, if even J.K. Rowling talks about, like, if transitioning had been an option back then, she might have become a trans man instead of becoming who she turning into who she has turned into. And we see parts of that with Mariam being frustrated by the liberties, or like the freedom that Yeshu gets after transitioning, and being seen as a boy by just about everyone except her family, who knows and can't accept that. And there's a lot of envy, jealousy, and frustration in there. And I think what I really respect about Ryman in a lot of ways is how he manages to show that, but also show how petty it is, but how understandable in a lot of ways it may be for people who are in a generation where that option just wasn't there, and to figure out how to have strong female roles for those who want, gender equality, but also allow those who are just, well, men, to approach those freedoms and those opportunities as men instead of as women. And I think he does do a lot of really interesting things with that, just from like the way he does not make any of this explicit. He just tells that story, and I think that's a wonderful part of it for me as someone who, as I said, not trans, so I can't speak for how realistic all of this is, how real it feels, how authentic it is, but I can say it did definitely give me an insight, or not an insight, but made me sort of it gave me empathy in a lot of ways, and I really appreciated that. But as I said, the fact that we're talking about Jesus as a trans man, I don't think is the most important aspect here. It's one way of doing that, and I'll come back to why I think Ryman chose that way. But there's more here. See, being the Messiah is kind of well, you're a bit of a special person here. And I think the main core part of this story is how having someone this very, very special in a lot of ways, how that warps and impacts everyone around, how there is a human and emotional, sometimes real physical cost and price to be paid by everyone around that. If you have a family, one member of your family has any form of special needs, or is different from societal expectations, whether they are, incredibly famous for being really brilliant at something, whether they have a disability, whether they or, just stand out in some form or other, there is a cost to everyone around that. And obviously, that's bad. That's a problem of society, because, and this, I think, is why situating this story in this way in this very specific place and time works so well, because it is a society full of these external pressures and expectations that people feel the need, and sometimes it's a real physical need. It's like the family is starving, and Abatha, marrying that guy, feels she's helping her family, and Yeshu, being loud, obnoxious, a possibly Messiah, a trans man, does for her feels like undermining her attempt to save the family. So you have these tensions that feel very real for those living through it. And I think while the trans thing is chosen here, it could have been anything else. Being the Messiah alone is enough of that, and I think that does in fact sort of contain the core of this story. The human cost of having someone you love, someone you see a lot of yourself in, go their own way, becoming their own person, and the cost of being dragged along because they change the world around them. And whether we want to or not, like if we differ from what is considered the norm or normality, we do warp the world around us, whether we want to or not. And I think him does explore that specific part in a lot of ways, and we see that with Plato, the architect, the builder in general, how when Jeshu becomes sort of replaces his son in a lot of ways, and how when Jeshu moves off, Plato becomes incredibly angry and frustrated, and we see that these different people reacting to someone because they all put something of themselves into that person. They want them to be the Messiah. They want them to be their son. They want them to be a dutiful daughter that actually does the family thing. They want him to be all of these things. They want him. I need to pronounce this more carefully, I think. They want him to be all of these things, and Jeshu does not. Jeshu goes his own way, and that, I think, is the core of the story that does make this so relatable, because See, there is that quote in Matthew, right? Whatever you did for or to the least of my brethren or brothers and sisters, you did for me or to me. And that's the point. None of us is Jesus. None of us is Mariam or anyone else around that family. But we all have people in our way, in our lives, in our families that are, going their own way, doing their own thing, and turning into special people. And the idea of accepting people for who they are and who they want to be, and not putting ourselves into that, not putting too much of our own expectations into that, that's a lesson we all can learn on that smaller sort of scale, that smaller stage. And I think that's why him spoke so much to me. I did see myself in there as well. And I think in a lot of situations, I'm like, yeah, I fucked up. I could have done better. Which is, I guess, as Christian a message as you can put into a book that is technically about trans Jesus. Now let's move on and talk a bit more about the way the story then progresses, the movement, the ending of the story, and how all of that comes together. See, as I said, the focus is on Jeshu becoming Jeshu, becoming sort of the bad boy of the village, being popular with everyone, obviously being very charismatic, and then at some point when Joseph dies, deciding to go on his way and to start preaching and being good at it and being successful at it. And I think this is really important because during that part of the story, we see how women that follow him, and we have Mary Magdalene, we have, I forgot her name, we have different strong women doing their own thing in that room. So it is sort of answering, or not answering, but showing the way that this jealousy, this envy that we see sometimes in parts of anti-trans discourse, turf discourse, crop up, how this is sort of unnecessary, because there is that space where everyone can do what they want and be as free as they want to be in that space. There's this wonderful moment when Mariam kind of realizes the whole thing and gets it and starts writing down, and starts sort of writing, following Jeshu, finally accepting Jeshu as her son and the person he wants to be. When we see all of that, which is sort of Ryman's depiction of the Sermon on the Mount, to be clear, and the idea of having, that other woman, that heavily disabled woman, dance the things that that Jeshu preaches, which is, sign language basically, and having that full acceptance of people getting it. I think that is a really powerful part of this book as well, because it shows that there is, in situations that are as fraught as they, as late Second Temple Judaism in Palestine under Roman occupation and so forth, people need that. There is an almost like animal need, deep-seated need for us to be shown that there is a better way, that there is an alternative, that we can go somewhere, we can be ourselves, to have that. And the way that whole scene of the Sermon on the Mount is described, it's very, very much like a pop concert, like a rock concert, where you have thousands of people standing there, and, there may be something in that, how these events are seen, because they answer to something deep in us, that need to be different than the absolute shithole we are in right now. And I think that's like the second part of this story, people slowly realizing that there is an alternative, which I think is, well, as I said, is very powerful. And now let's try to bring this all together before I lose my track completely, with the end. Now, the end is, of course, the end that it always has to be. Jeshu goes to Jerusalem. He confronts people that he has confronted before. He confronts authority, different forms of authority. I really like the way the whole scene is played out with Pontius Pilate sitting there and going like, well, it's not really my job, it's Herod's job. Herod in this case obviously being not the same Herod the Great that we all know from the further earlier parts of the Gospels, but the grandson at this point, Herod the Third, I think it is, who's sort of still a figure of authority and being banded around between these different forms of authority, because the powers that be rarely know what to do with public, with popular movements and the popular demand. They just want to sit in their palaces and do whatever they want to do and enjoy their riches. And that scene is just really interesting, really nicely done, because it showcases exactly that, how the problem is like battered around between those who have the power to do something, instead of actually tackled. It feels familiar, doesn't it? There's also, the whole fact that Pontius Pilate once again has a bit of a headache, and it did remind me a bit of the Master and Margarita and the Pontius Pilate scenes in there, which are really interesting and fascinating and fun. I wonder how much they have been sort of an inspiration for Geoff Ryman here. Anyway, seeing that scene and then Mariam falling back when she wants to save her son by proclaiming that Jeshu can't be crucified because Jeshu is in fact a woman. And then, the miracle. And then it took an actual miracle to get the Messiah crucified at the end. I think there's something really interesting here, because all over the place we see, whenever Jeshu does do a miracle of some form, performs a miracle, there's that moment when the world shudders and we maybe skip track to a different universe and whatnot. The main point here is the cost. The cost to Jeshu. And every time he does that, we see him suffer more. And this, once again, I think is important. If we assume that Jeshu, being a trans man in this case, or in any form special, being forced to constantly prove your worth, your identity as someone that everyone has sort of different expectations upon, is incredibly tiring. I've spoken about that, how it's sometimes difficult for me to talk about my disability, how to take that. And I'm still incredibly privileged, but every time Jeshu is forced to perform a miracle is someone doubting his identity. And it's slowly built up, and it ends with someone basically forcing Jeshu to prove once again his identity. In this case, not so much as the Messiah who can perform miracles, but as a man. So the miracle he performs is, well, magical gender reassignment surgery, I guess. But it's still, I think it's important to show that, because the pain is real, and the pain is described or portrayed really, well. The general exhaustion and pain that comes with constantly being questioned, constantly having to reassert yourself. And I think that part does go for all of us. That goes for all of us in different ways. And we should learn from that is to not question. And if people actually fulfill our expectations, be thankful, right? The scene where a lot of lepers are being healed by Jeshu, and only one of them decides to actually go say thank you, I think is really emblematic in that as well. So what we see here is how Ryman takes parts from the Gospels that we all know and reframes them in a really important way, in a powerful way that is necessary for our own world, which is where we are going to put this all together. Why now? Why the way it is? The way Geoff Ryman describes and portrays the time and place of Jeshu's life, I think, is interesting, because there are a lot of parallels to the life and the place we find ourselves today, right? We have to sort of signal loyalty to different places, to possibly a religion, possibly societal expectations, classist expectations. We have to try to survive. A lot of us are poor. We don't think of ourselves as poor, but we have to work. Some of us have to work like 3 jobs to survive, barely survive. A lot of us are fighting all the same kind of battles, and it's so easy to give in and offload so much on someone else who, by just being not the perfect cog in the machine, makes our lives somewhat harder, as long as we keep playing that same game. As long as we keep playing that same game. And right now, yes, trans people are the perfect example for that, but it's so many others. And I think that's the lesson we need to learn from him, to not to see ourselves in that position, not so much in the position of Jeshu, but more in the position of Abatha, more in the position of Mariam, more in the position of Joseph, to see ourselves in all of, and how we relate to people just because they make our lives that already suck just slightly more difficult, and it's not their fault. Whenever something like that happens, we have to remember that it is the fault of the world that we are currently in, and we can change that world. We can escape that world. We can get out any time, as long as we do it all together. And dismantle capitalism, dismantle nation states, do all of those things. Right? There's a very, very powerful message in this story, and has always been in there. The potential, the revolutionary potential of that story has always been there. And Ryman just reframes it by telling a historical story, reframes it for today. And it's important, I think, to see these parallels, which I think leads us to those final pages. Mariam going, I don't want to see the end. I kind of know how it ends. Once again, this is something we all know, right? We know how things end once the machine starts grinding. We don't need to see this. What is interesting, however, is obviously the idea of Jeshu going through all of this, which is sort of where it gets religious, right? Well, Jeshu going through all of this because it's not so much that we have to learn about God, but God has to learn about us. And, that's where you can go the science fiction route of, the observer having to learn about the observed and all of that quantum stuff. I'm not going into, but I think that message goes for all of us as well. We need to understand the suffering. We need to embrace the people that suffer, to give them, a hope and a hold in our world, which is exactly what Mariam does to God after the suffering. But I think it's still important to understand that the place we have built ourselves, or someone outside of ourselves, the previous generations, the place we have built is a machine that produces pain. And we can try to get out of that. But if we see someone suffering that pain, we need to also give them hope. We need to hold them. We need to embrace them. And then we can try to make a better place. So, yeah, I think it is clear why Jesus is a trans man in this version. I don't know, a couple of decades ago, it would have been a different person that has to be, the person embodying what Jesus, or in this case, Jeshu, stands for. It may be someone else in the future, but right now, in the year 2023 or 2024 now, it's the perfect example. It's the perfect way of talking about how we have built systems that force us to be cruel to each other, that force us or make it very, very easy for us to give in and blame someone else, want everyone to be perfect just to minimize harm and pain for ourselves, instead of actually deciding to turn around and do something else and, leave the system behind. In this case, Jesus, Jeshu, being a trans man, is the perfect example. And you should go and read him by Geoff Ryman and probably become a revolutionary afterwards, maybe? I don't know. I have so many more thoughts about this book. I hope you have some too. I hope you go and read it. It's marvelous. It's made me think. It's made me cry. It's made me laugh. It's just really good. And the fact that Ryman narrates the whole audiobook with all these fun British accents does lead to that dissonance that kind of makes it easier to see that part that is, happening in our world. It's relevant to us. I think that's a really good choice as well. As I said, go read the book. And if you have read the book, please let me know what you think. I really want to talk about this. And so far, there's no one. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. I'll try to talk about something less fun. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, see ya. Cheers.